This is Montreal Mobstars, featuring a Montreal crime from 1976 where robbers stole close to $3 million from a BRINK'S truck in a daytime robbery in downtown Montreal. The story begins with Gilles Lachapelle, a high school dropout who grew up in Montreal's East End. Gilles Lachapelle enlisted in the Canadian Army during the Korean War, where he was stationed as a machine gunner. And when he returned to Montreal following years of service, Gilles Lachapelle had a young Japanese wife named Luong, whom he supported working odd jobs around the city. In the early 1960s, Montreal was experiencing a housing boom from factors that included Expo 67 and the expansion of Montreal. BRINK'S, the armored car service, was on a hiring spree with men who had experience working with firearms. This was following two wars that saw Canadian troops on the front lines, World War II and the Korean War, and BRINK'S had no shortage of veterans applying for the positions. Gilles Lachapelle was hired by BRINK'S in 1961 at the age of 31 as a guard, protecting the armored cars loaded with millions of dollars that drove around the city of Montreal. By 1971, Lachapelle was promoted to a driver, a position that kept him inside the armored vehicle throughout the workday. He held that position for more than 4 years without any incident, but all that changed when he met fellow BRINK'S employee Roland Brunette. Unlike Lachapelle, who was content with the job and the reliable income it provided, Brunette was looking to pull off an inside job and rob the company of as much money as possible. Brunette had connections to Montreal's East End Gang, a French-Canadian gang of criminals led by Roger Provençal. Within the ranks of the East End Gang were the Provençal siblings. By the late 1960s, the Provençal clan was allegedly running operations in Montreal that included stick-ups, robberies, drug dealing, pimping, extortion, and loan sharking. At the time, Montreal's criminal territory was divided between the Francophone East End Gang and the West End Gang, led by Frank Dunie Ryan, who were mostly Irish-Canadian and spoke English. The West End Gang was a small army of criminals operating out of the neighborhoods of Griffintown, Port St. Charles, and Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. Many of the gang's members had specialties in criminal skills such as safe cracking, extortion, gambling, robbery, burglaries, murder, smuggling, drug dealing, and other criminal activities. Punishments for robberies that had no injuries or fatalities differed greatly between Canada and the US in the 1970s. An expected sentence in the US could be between 10 to 20 years for robbery without injuries or fatalities, while in Canada, penalties ranged from between 5 to 7 years for a similar crime. If during the course of the robbery an innocent bystander was killed, punishment in Canada was automatically a capital crime that received the death penalty. Canada abolished the death penalty in the summer of 1976. And so, in January 1976, members of the West End Gang got together with members of the East End Gang with the intent to plan a BRINK'S armored car robbery in downtown Montreal. For the plan to be successful, they needed a BRINK'S employee that they could corrupt. They needed an inside man. Provençal enlisted Rocky Carganon, a member of the East End Gang, to suggest to BRINK'S employee Roland Brunette a vague plan to rob a BRINK'S truck. Brunette was employed as an armored car guard. However, the crew needed a driver for their plan to work, and Brunette was tasked with recruiting an armored car driver who would be willing to participate in a robbery. Having a driver as their inside man would almost ensure that the plan would go off without firing a single shot, which would be crucial if they wanted to avoid Canada's death row. Brunette approached Gilles Lachapelle with the idea to rob a BRINK'S truck, and Lachapelle was interested in the idea. On two separate occasions in January and February of 1976, Lachapelle was picked up after work and driven to meet two men to discuss the details of the robbery. To hide their true identity from Lachapelle, both of the men were wearing paper bags with slits for eyes. Being driven to an unknown location to meet with masked men must have been uncomfortable for Lachapelle. The men who wanted to remain anonymous were later identified by police as two members of the East End Gang, Roger Provençal and Michel Pellon, a former police officer who became a member of the East End Gang. During the first meeting, Lachapelle told the men how each Tuesday his crew picked up over $3 million from the Royal Bank of Canada Tower in downtown Montreal. Once the money was safely locked away in the armored van, the three guards assigned to the van went on a 15-minute break in the bank's cafeteria. Lachapelle also explained that the contents of an armored car are protected behind thick bulletproof glass and heavy steel plating, which is resistant to most handguns and rifles. A driver would only consider opening the door to a would-be robber if they felt their life was threatened, and the threat would require more firepower than the weapons used during the average stick-up job. The takeaway from that meeting was that a high-caliber anti-aircraft or anti-tank machine gun was needed for the plan to be successful. Imagine LaChapelle's surprise when the group met 2 weeks later and LaChapelle was shown a U.S. Army surplus anti-aircraft Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun with a 54-inch barrel and 300 armor-piercing bullets mounted to a tripod in the back of a stolen white Econoline van. The Browning M2 50 caliber, a gun that's so effective it's still being used by some militaries, was designed to pierce armor-plated military vehicles including planes and tanks. While stationed in Korea, LaChapelle quite possibly saw a Browning M2 being used by US troops during combat. LaChapelle told the masked men that the gun would be enough of a threat to force any Brink's driver to open their doors, if ordered by a robber. With the right weapon now in the hands of the would-be robbers, LaChapelle knew he was past the point of no return. A few weeks had passed without any word from the masked criminals via their accomplice Brunette, and LaChapelle's nervousness was likely palpable. On February 19th, it was an ordinary workday and LaChapelle was at Brink's when he was approached by Brunette. Brunette pulled LaChapelle aside and mentioned that a meeting was set for the next evening, during which the date and robbery plan would be explained to LaChapelle. LaChapelle wasn't an active member of Montreal's criminal underworld, so those organizing the heist likely kept LaChapelle on a need-to-know basis when it came to sharing details about the heist. When LaChapelle met with the masked men the following night, one of the masked men explained to LaChapelle exactly how the robbery would go down and what the criminals expected of LaChapelle if he was to receive his share of the loot. His share, he was told, was 50% of the loot, divided between LaChapelle, Brunette, and Rocky Carignan, funds LaChapelle was planning to use to move to Japan with his wife Luong. On March 24th, 1976, at around 2 p.m., Gilles LaChapelle navigated the Brink's van down Notre Dame Street and turned onto Dollard Street, the single-lane alley between Notre Dame Street and St. James Street, which is now called St. Jacques. It was a typically cold winter afternoon in downtown Montreal when Gilles LaChapelle parked the Brink's van next to the bank's loading bay doors directly behind the Royal Bank of Canada Tower. The triggerman, Johnny St. Pierre, wielded a shotgun. The other guards, Wilfred Grant and Joseph Durant, proceeded to load the shipment of valuables that included almost $2.8 million from the bank's secure loading bay into the Brink's van. Once the transfer of valuables was completed without incident, St. Pierre, Grant, and Durant went on break in the bank's cafeteria, leaving LaChapelle alone in the armored truck for about 15 minutes. LaChapelle sat in the driver's seat of the Brink's van as he watched the white Econoline van back into the alley from St. James Street. The rear doors of the Econoline opened, exposing the 54-inch barrel of the Browning M2 50 caliber gun pointed directly towards the Brink's van. None of this was a surprise to LaChapelle, who knew the details of the robbery from his meetings with the masked men. LaChapelle, who was scanning the rearview mirrors of the armored van, noticed 3 men in trench coats entering the alley from behind the van. Unsure whether the men were police officers sent to bust the heist or simply businessmen taking a shortcut through the alley, LaChapelle continued to watch as the men approached from behind the Brink's truck. Rocky Carignan jumped out of the Econoline's passenger seat and casually started walking towards the Brink's truck, but hesitated when he didn't receive the all-clear sign from LaChapelle. LaChapelle was supposed to flash the van's headlights if everything was okay, but instead of giving the all-clear, LaChapelle shook his head no while making eye contact with Rocky. Immediately aborting the plan, Rocky jumped back into the passenger seat of the Econoline and the van sped away as its rear doors hastily slammed shut. The Brink's guards returned from the break a few minutes later and the crew ended their workday without the guards ever realizing how close they came to being robbed. Later that week, LaChapelle was approached by Brunette at work, who demanded an explanation as to why the heist was called off at the last minute. LaChapelle reassured Brunette that he still wanted to participate in the robbery. LaChapelle explained to Brunette how he saw 3 men approaching from behind the van and thought that they could be cops sent to prevent the robbery from happening. Later this same week, Brunette told LaChapelle that another meeting was scheduled with Brunette's masked associates, who weren't happy that LaChapelle backed out at the last minute. The following evening at the meeting with LaChapelle, Roger Provençal, from behind a paper bag, was visibly upset that the robbery hadn't occurred as planned. Provençal stressed to LaChapelle that the robbery was going to happen the following Tuesday, and there was no more chances to stall or back out. Provençal had one change of plan for LaChapelle. The Econoline van with the M2 machine gun won't be used in the rescheduled robbery. Provençal decided it was too risky to drive around a stolen van with an M2 machine gun in the back. Instead, the empty armored van would be abandoned without its valuable cargo next to the stolen white Econoline van, which would have the M2 50 caliber machine gun mounted in the back for police to conveniently find. And so, on March 30th, 1976, the Brinks truck, again driven by LaChapelle, arrived at the loading bay doors of the Royal Bank Tower. In the minutes that followed, close to $3 million in valuables were loaded by the Brinks guards onto the armored van. Once the transfer of valuables was complete, guards St. Pierre, Grant, and Durant went on break in the Royal Bank Tower cafeteria, leaving LaChapelle alone with the cash. LaChapelle sat in the driver's seat as a beige, half-ton van backed into the alley from St. James, coming to a stop directly in front of the Brinks armored truck. LaChapelle scanned the rearview mirrors, not seeing anything suspicious this time, flashed the headlights for the Brinks truck, signaling the all clear that the robbery crew was waiting for. Rocky Carignan exited the beige van from the passenger seat and casually walked towards the passenger side of the Brinks truck. As Rocky approached the truck, LaChapelle unlocked the passenger door for Rocky. Once Rocky was inside the armored truck, the beige van exited the alley onto St. James Street, with the armored truck following closely behind. The vans turned onto University Avenue, now called Robert Bourassa Boulevard, and then onto the Bonaventure Expressway as the vans continued southbound. The vans exited at Nuns Island, heading to a deserted parking lot between a tennis club and railway tracks. The beige van that LaChapelle was following came to a stop next to two awaiting vans, the white Econoline van with the M2 mounted in the back, and an aluminum-paneled cargo van. Rocky then opened all of the armored truck's doors, and his valuable load was hastily removed in just a few minutes. As the loot was being transferred to the aluminum-paneled van, East End gang member Michel Poulon handcuffed LaChapelle to the steering wheel of the Brinks van. From start to finish, the robbery took less than 25 minutes, without a single shot being fired or anyone sustaining injuries or fatalities. While valuables were being removed from the armored truck, the Brinks guards finished their break and returned to the alley to find the truck that they were hired to protect had vanished. They quickly notified bank security, who notified Montreal Police Dispatch. Police were quickly on scene within minutes, including detectives from the Armed Robbery Division, who questioned the Brinks guards. LaChapelle, alone and handcuffed to the steering wheel of the Brinks van, noticed that one of the handcuffs wasn't fully locked, and he was able to get out of the van. Faking his escape, he punched himself in the face before going to the nearby tennis club to call for help. The receptionist at Club de Tennis Ile de Sur let LaChapelle use the phone, and he called Brinks to alert dispatch that he had been robbed. The dispatcher, Andre Cockburn, testified in court when LaChapelle called that he spoke calmly when relaying the details of the robbery over the phone. Cockburn called police at 3:04 p.m., who at that time already knew of the robbery. Uniformed squad cars and detectives were dispatched to the Nuns Island location, where they found a roughed up and anxious LaChapelle waiting between the empty armored truck and the white Econoline van, armed with the M2 machine gun in the back. The collaborative effort by the East End and West End gangs to rob a Brinks armored truck appeared to be a complete success. When the news of the robbery broke the following morning, the city of Montreal and the rest of the country were shocked by the brazen daytime heist. In total, $2,775,884 in mixed denominations were stolen, along with 29 boxes, each containing $5,000 in gold coins commemorating Montreal's 1976 Olympic Games. A task force of 7 police officers and detectives selected from Montreal Police's armed robbery squad was assembled to investigate the robbery. The task force, led by Montreal Police Detective Sergeant Andre Savard, included Jean-Pierre Gilbert, Kevin McGarr, Ross Trudel, and they started referring to themselves as the Rubber Duck Squad after a song lyric of a then popular song. Montreal Police was concerned with keeping the identities of the Rubber Duck Squad and the information that they gathered confidential, as an attempt to keep information from corrupt officers paid by either the West End or the East End gang, or in the case of some police officers, paid by both gangs. The Rubber Duck Squad worked from a meeting room inside a private club, a location known only to Rubber Duck members, and when using the police radio channels, which all police officers and even members of the public could overhear, the Rubber Duck Squad referred to themselves in code names only known to each other. The investigators quickly established the Browning M2 machine gun was unable to fire, as it was still coated in the grease that it was originally packed and shipped in. They then traced the machine gun's serial numbers to a gun dealer in Kentucky who sold the gun earlier that year to somebody using fake ID. Later on during the course of the investigation, the squad learned through an informant that the buyer was John Shepard, known to police as a member of the West End gang. A robbery of this complexity would take a considerable amount of planning and access to specialized criminal skills needed to successfully pull off the crime. So when the Rubber Duck Squad learned that the gun buyer had connections to the West End gang, gang, police had a target to focus on. Over the course of a few weeks, Montreal Police raided many of the bars and hideouts in Griffintown, Point St. Charles, and NDG. These locations, which were known to police to be either used or owned by members of the West End gang, and during the course of the raids, dozens of people had been detained or arrested by police. Gilles Lachapelle was subjected to a lie detector test, but Lachapelle stuck to the story he rehearsed countless times, and he passed the test. The other guards who worked in Lachapelle's truck unsurprisingly passed their lie detector tests. One of the places raided by police was Peg's Motel, a low-rent motel at 1980 Westmore Avenue, frequented by hookers who serviced their customers in rented rooms. Between clients, they hung out at the adjacent biker bar that smelled of stale beer and freshly spilled blood and vomit. Police discovered while searching the motel's rooms a pound of hash, a large cache of guns, and of great concern to the police were empty money bags, possible remnants from the infamous robbery. When police checked the motel's reservation logbook, the room wasn't listed as rented, and the police weren't able to charge anyone with possession of the guns and hashish. However, finding the money bags, although empty, gave the task force confidence that they were getting closer to those ultimately responsible for the crime. With increased police pressure put upon the West End gang, members of the gang started to strike back against police. The first retaliatory incident occurred on May 1st, 1976 in the parking lot of Peg's Motel. Andre Savard and Jean-Pierre Gilbert of the Rubber Duck Squad were staking out the motel when shots were fired from a high-powered rifle that shattered the rear-view window of their unmarked police car, barely missing the two officers. The sniper evaded capture that evening, but police later learned from an informant that the shooter was John Slavy, a member of the West End gang, who allegedly killed a police officer during a robbery in 1961. On May 5th, just a few nights after the Peg's Motel shooting, Rubber Duck member Kevin McGarr was almost run over by a car speeding towards him outside of Nitolo's Garden restaurant on Upper Lachine. The car was driven by Raymond Riccardi, a 20-year-old member of the West End gang. McGarr was able to jump out of harm's way, and Riccardi was subsequently charged with attempted murder of a peace officer and sentenced to 6 months in prison for the crime. Police received a tip the following night that members of the robbery crew could be found at the Little Club, a rough-and-tumble bar on Bishop Street that had connections to the West End gang. During a search of the club with partner Kevin McGarr, Rubber Duck member Ross Trudell tripped a booby trap when he picked up a shotgun. The trigger was primed to fire when the shotgun was moved. Although the shotgun did in fact fire, there were no injuries sustained by McGarr or Trudell that evening, but things were different later that week. On May 8th, officers Trudell and McGarr were searching Molly McGuire's bar at 2204 St. Catherine Street West, across from Montreal Forum. McGarr was searching the upstairs section of the bar when an altercation broke out between him and three patrons, brothers Thomas and Edward O'Neill, and their friend Daniel Sullivan, proceeded to beat up McGarr with fists and broken beer bottles until police backup arrived on scene. McGarr was laid up in hospital for a few weeks while he recovered from a shattered cheekbone and a fractured skull, but the beating didn't affect his memory. He named those responsible for the beating, and the culprits were quickly apprehended. After more than 40 police raids in West End Montreal, dozens of people had been detained or arrested by police. Gang leaders Roger Provençal of the East End gang and Dunie Ryan of the West End gang were questioned by police. However, neither of the gang leaders answered any of the police questions. During the course of the investigations to recover the stolen money and apprehend those responsible, informants gave police a critical piece of information: that much of the money from the heist was already laundered in Las Vegas by somebody named Julius Alter. If the money was already out of the country, that would explain, despite raiding more than 40 locations, police weren't able to find the majority of the stolen money. Informants also tipped off the Rubber Duck members to a smuggling ring responsible for importing 10 to 30 pounds of hashish per month. The overwhelming police pressure put upon the West End gang was starting to boil over, creating a feud between Rubber Ducks and the West End gang. At one point during the investigation, criminal defense lawyer Sidney Leithman contacted Andre Savard to let the detective know that Dunie Ryan had placed a $50,000 hit for the death of Andre Savard, the highest-ranking officer of the Rubber Duck Squad. Savard was placed under 24-hour police protection for a few weeks, and nothing became of the hit. In June, just 2 months after the robbery, police started to arrest those responsible. The first arrested was Ray-Jean Duff, 20 years old at the time, who was charged with stealing the Econoline van used during the heist. During police questioning, Duff sang like Celine Dion, telling interrogators of the Rubber Duck Squad that he was given $70,000 for his involvement in the robbery. Even though Duff cooperated with police, he was charged with robbery, forcible confinement of BRINK'S driver Gilles Lachapelle, and theft of the cargo van used in the heist. During questioning, Duff confirmed the Rubber Duck Squad's suspicions that Roger Provençal and Michel Pellon were partly responsible for orchestrating the heist. Provençal and Pellon were arrested on the same day and charged with conspiracy to commit the robbery as a result of Duff's information. The two were each released on $25,000 bail 4 days later. Police were concerned for Duff's safety after he gave police the information that got Provençal and Pellon arrested, and Duff was held in jail for more than 2 months until his charges were dismissed by a judge for insufficient evidence after his lawyer eventually argued that Duff was only hired to steal a van a month prior to the robbery and had no knowledge of the plan to rob Brink's, nor was he present during the robbery. Duff's charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Following the robbery, Duff paid cash when he bought a brand new $7,000 Camaro sports car. Commercial Union Insurance, the insurance company who insured Brink's, tried to seize the car as it was presumed to have been bought with proceeds from the robbery. Montreal Police disbanded the Rubber Duck Squad in June 1976, with all of the members returning to the positions in other major crime units. The case, which remained open and was still actively investigated by other detectives, haunted Andre Savard, who continued to work on the case despite being assigned elsewhere. The first death connected to the Brink's heist was John Slavies, who was shot and killed by Montreal Police on June 15, 1976, only a couple weeks after he was accused of shooting at Andre Savard and J.P. Gilbert as they staked out Peg's Motel. Slavy returned home to his apartment at 2555 Benny Avenue in NDG after a late-night poker game with friends. Slavy drove into the apartment garage under his building at around 3:30 in the morning and parked his car. As he was walking towards the doors to exit the parking garage, Rubber Duck Squad members Andre Savard, Ross Trudel, along with other members of Montreal Police, announced themselves by shouting "Police" as they emerged from hiding spots behind parked cars and cement columns. The officers had been lying in wait since around midnight in the parking garage, and they were eager to arrest Slavy and question him to get more information about the robbery. Police allege that Slavy drew a gun and aimed towards the police after they announced themselves, and they were forced to fire upon John Slavy. Slavy's friends who were present at the poker game stated to the press that Slavy was likely unarmed at the time of his death. They said that given the late hours Slavy was driving home, he thought he might be pulled over by police, and having a gun on him could worsen the situation. He left the gun with a friend. On June 9th, a coroner's inquest into the shooting cleared the police officers involved in Slavy's death. Brink's employees Gilles Lachapelle and Roland Burnett were secretly recorded by police informant Philippe Vanier as the two confessed to their part in the crime. Vanier was working with police to help solve the robbery because apparently he felt he was supposed to be used in the heist but was passed over by Burnett. Vanier passed along the incriminating recording to Rubber Duck Squad, and police searched the homes of Lachapelle and Burnett. Police didn't find anything connected to the robbery in Lachapelle's home, but Burnett's home was a literal gold mine. Police found $12,000 in cash and some of the Olympic commemorative gold coins stolen from the Brink's van. On December 21st, 1979, Lachapelle and Burnett were each convicted of conspiracy for the robbery and received 4 years at La Maquisa prison north of Montreal for their part in the crime. In January 1980, the decomposing body of Ray-Jean Duff was found by a farmer in a field near Quebec City. A contract killer named Gilles Bourg was arrested by police for other murders for hire and became an informant to help reduce his sentence. One of the crimes Bourg admitted to was the murder of Ray-Jean Duff, the 20-year-old who stole the Econoline van used in the robbery. Bourg claimed that in June 1979, Roger Provençal allegedly paid Bourg at least $25,000 to beat up Ray-Jean Duff as an effort to keep Duff from testifying at Provençal's upcoming trial. Duff, however, died from the injuries sustained during the beating. Suspected money launderer Julius Alter was arrested on November 25, 1980, with $700,000 in stolen bonds and a stolen Renoir painting valued at $300,000. When he received sentencing for the crime the following year, he was 66 years old and received community service and probation instead of prison time. In 1984, police named Alter as a money launderer of the stolen Brink's cash, responsible for laundering around $500,000. Later that year, Alter was almost killed when bullets shattered a window of a car he was driving. Scared for his life, Alter met with Andre Savard and shared any information he knew of the crime with a detective. Alter likely left Montreal in 1985 and presumed to have died of natural causes elsewhere. As Lachapelle was preparing to be released from prison after nearly completing his sentence, he was visited by Andre Savard. The detective told Lachapelle how Roger Provençal had likely ordered the murder of Ray-Jean Duff and the attempted murder of Julius Alter, and that Lachapelle LaChapelle and his wife Luong may be next on Provençal's hit list. Savard offered LaChapelle police protection and relocation in exchange for testifying against Provençal. A few days later, LaChapelle accepted the offer, and despite testifying at Provençal's trial, 2 additional years were added to LaChapelle and Brunet's prison sentences. Savard, using Provençal's intention to murder witnesses or those with information who could testify against him, he was able to get more members of Roger Provençal's inner circle to agree to testify against Provençal. The perseverance that Savard showed with regards to investigating the crime gave Crown prosecutors more than 40 witnesses in Roger Provençal's upcoming trial. Despite dozens of informants who testified for the Crown, including Roger Provençal's brother Bernard, the jury found Provençal not guilty exactly 8 years after the robbery on March 30th, 1984. Police suspected Roger Provençal earned more than $1 million from the BRINK'S robbery. John Shepard, who is presumed to have purchased the Browning M2 used in the robbery, was found not guilty due to insufficient evidence. Michel Pallone pled guilty and was convicted of robbery and sentenced to 3 years in prison. At the time, he was already serving 4 years for an unrelated drug charge. Raymond Riccardi, the man who tried to run over Kevin McGarr, was murdered in 1981 along with his girlfriend. Both were found shot to death in a basement of a building in Ville-Émard, Quebec. Frank Dunie Ryan was never charged due to his suspected involvement in the BRINK'S robbery. On November 13, 1984, he was shot and killed outside of Nitello's Garden restaurant on Upper Lachine over a possible power struggle within the West End gang. At the time of his death, Dunie Ryan was known as the King of Coke and considered to be one of North America's largest cocaine importers. Police found on his body more than $6,000 in cash, a diamond-encrusted Rolex, and a gold chain. His death created a power vacuum that caused a decade of bloodshed on the streets of Montreal. Roche Rocky Carignan pled guilty and was sentenced to 8 years. Carignan served his sentence and was paroled in 1989. He tried to move on from his life of crime and began volunteering at Old Brewery Mission, a homeless shelter in downtown Montreal. But somebody had a long memory. Late in the evening of November 19, 1991, Carignan answered the doorbell of his home in Lavaltrie, Quebec, and an unknown gunman fired 4 bullets into Carignan's chest. Carignan managed to survive the attack, and the gunman was never apprehended. Roger Provençal continued his life of crime in Montreal until November 9, 1992, when he was gunned down by 2 unknown gunmen while leaving a store on Beaubien Street in Montreal's East End. Roger Provençal was 57 years old at the time of his death. Andre Savard retired from Montreal Police in 1992. He moved to the U.S. for a number of years with his family before returning to Montreal to work as a successful private investigator. In September 2008, Kevin McGarr was appointed to the position of President and CEO of the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority. Of the almost $3 million stolen from the BRINK'S robbery, less than $500,000 was ever recovered. $290,000 was found in the basement of a Westmount home of a friend of John Slavi's. Police suspected that Slavy stashed the money there prior to his death without the resident's knowledge. An additional $35,000 was found by police in the home of Ray Janduff's uncle. If you made it this far and you like this video, please hit the thumb and also subscribe to our channel to find out when we release new videos. Thanks a lot and have a great day.